Admiral James Carter walked into the busy airport, pulling his small suitcase behind him. It was just another flight, just another trip. He had traveled hundreds of times before, both in uniform and in civilian clothes. Today, he was dressed in comfortable jeans and a plain polo shirt, just wanting to relax on his journey. He had spent over 3 decades serving his country, leading men and women in the Navy, making tough decisions, and carrying heavy responsibilities. But today, he was just a regular passenger looking forward to a peaceful flight. The airport buzzed with activity. Families hugged their loved ones goodbye. Business travelers rushed past with their phones in hand, and long lines formed at security. James had booked a first-class seat for this flight, hoping to enjoy a quiet trip before an important meeting the next day. He had earned this moment of comfort. As he reached the airline counter to check in, he noticed a woman at the desk assisting passengers. Her name tag read Karen Thompson. She was busy typing on her computer, occasionally looking up to call the next person in line. When it was James's turn, he stepped forward with a polite smile and handed her his ticket. "Good afternoon," he said. Karen barely looked at him. She took the ticket and glanced at it quickly. Then she frowned and looked at him again, this time with a puzzled expression. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, as if something didn't make sense. She checked the ticket again, tapping her long fingernails against the counter. "This is for first class," she said slowly, as if he didn't already know. James nodded. "Yes, that's correct." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" James kept his calm. "Yes, I'm sure." Instead of processing his check-in, Karen hesitated. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type anything. She looked at him again, as if waiting for him to explain himself. Other passengers behind him were starting to get impatient, shifting from foot to foot. "First class is for premium passengers," Karen said, her voice firm. "Are you certain you're in the right line?" James took a deep breath. He had dealt with all kinds of situations in his career, life and death moments, complex missions, high-pressure decisions. But this was different. He wasn't in a war zone. He was just trying to board a plane. "Ma'am, I fly often. This is my ticket. Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. Karen sighed, as if she didn't believe him. She tapped a few keys on her keyboard, then shook her head. "I just need to verify something," she muttered, acting as if his ticket might be fake. A few passengers behind him started whispering. Some looked annoyed at the delay. Others seemed curious about what was going on. James could feel the stares, but he stood his ground, waiting for Karen to do her job. Instead, she picked up the phone. "I need a supervisor at the counter," she said, not even bothering to look at him. James stood at the counter, watching as Karen called for a supervisor. The way she acted made it seem like he had done something wrong. But all he did was hand her a first-class ticket. His own ticket, one he had paid for. He had traveled so many times before, yet this was the first time someone had looked at him like he didn't belong. The passengers behind him were starting to get impatient. Some sighed loudly, while others checked their watches. A few whispered among themselves, glancing at James, and then at Karen. He could hear small bits of conversation. "Why is it taking so long?" one person mumbled. "Maybe there's a problem with his ticket," another guessed. James remained calm, though he could feel the tension growing. He had faced much worse situations in life. This was nothing compared to the challenges he had overcome in his career, but still, it was frustrating. He had earned his place in first class, just like anyone else. Karen finally put the phone down and looked at him with a small, forced smile. "It'll just be a moment," she said, but there was no warmth in her voice. James nodded but said nothing. He could tell she still didn't believe he was supposed to be in first class. Maybe she thought he was lying. Maybe she thought he couldn't afford it. Whatever the reason, she was treating him differently, and he knew it. A few minutes later, a supervisor arrived. A tall man in a navy blue suit with a name tag that read Mr. Reynolds. He walked up to Karen and asked, What seems to be the issue? Karen leaned in and whispered something, but James heard part of it. I just want to confirm if this ticket is real. Mr. Reynolds glanced at James, then at the ticket. He scanned it into the system, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. After a few seconds, he frowned. Then he looked at Karen. This ticket is valid, he said in a clear voice. It's booked under James Carter, first class. There's no issue here. Karen blinked, clearly surprised. Oh, well, I just wanted to make sure, she said, trying to sound casual. Mr. Reynolds turned to James. I apologize for the delay, sir. You are good to go. James nodded. Thank you. As he reached for his ticket, Karen still looked unsure. Do you fly first class often? She asked hesitantly. James met her gaze. I travel regularly, he said simply. He didn't need to explain himself to her. Karen hesitated, then handed him his boarding pass. Enjoy your flight, she said, though she didn't sound happy about it. James took his ticket and walked toward the security checkpoint. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some still curious about what had happened. He didn't let it bother him. There was a time and place to address situations like this, and soon that time would come. James walked toward the security checkpoint, holding his boarding pass tightly. He was calm on the outside, but inside, he couldn't shake off what had just happened. He had traveled all over the world, sat in high-ranking military meetings, and commanded thousands of officers. Yet here he was, having to prove that he belonged in first class like any other paying passenger. The security line moved quickly, and within minutes, James was through. He made his way toward the gate, where passengers were already gathering, waiting for the boarding announcement. Some people were chatting, others were scrolling through their phones, and a few sat quietly, sipping coffee. It was just a normal airport scene. But for James, the earlier experience at the check-in counter still lingered in his mind. As he stood near the gate, he noticed Karen again. She had moved from the check-in desk to assist with the boarding process. She was standing near the first-class boarding line, checking tickets before letting passengers through. When she spotted James, her expression changed slightly. She seemed surprised to see him again, almost as if she had expected him to disappear. James ignored her and focused on his flight. Soon, the airline announced that first-class passengers could begin boarding. He stepped forward, handing his ticket to Karen once more. She took it, hesitated for just a second, then scanned it. The machine beeped, confirming his boarding pass was valid. She forced a smile and said, "Enjoy your flight, sir." James simply nodded and walked toward the jet bridge. As he entered the plane, the flight attendants greeted him warmly. "Welcome aboard," one of them said with a genuine smile. "Right this way, sir." James found his seat, a comfortable spot by the window in the first-class section. He placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, then sat down and let out a breath. Finally, he could relax. But just as he was getting comfortable, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but first class is only for first-class passengers." Karen's voice rang out from the front of the plane. James turned his head slightly to see what was happening. A woman, dressed in expensive clothes and carrying a designer bag, was arguing with Karen. There must be a mistake. The woman insisted, "I should be in first class." Karen checked her list and shook her head. "Your ticket is for economy, Mom." The woman huffed in frustration and stormed off toward the economy section. James watched as Karen returned to her station, looking flustered. It was ironic. Just minutes ago, she had doubted his place in first class, and now she was sending someone else back for the exact same reason. James shook his head slightly, but he said nothing. He simply leaned back in his seat, waiting for takeoff. He had a feeling the most interesting part of the journey was yet to come. James sat comfortably in his first-class seat, adjusting the headrest and stretching his legs. The soft leather seat and extra space were a welcome change from the tight, crowded seats in economy. He was looking forward to a peaceful flight, but a part of him couldn't forget how Karen had treated him earlier. The cabin crew moved around, assisting passengers as they settled in. A flight attendant offered James a drink before takeoff, and he politely declined, choosing instead to close his eyes for a moment. The gentle hum of the airplane filled the cabin, and he took a deep breath, ready to put the earlier incident behind him. Just as he was beginning to relax, he heard a small commotion near the entrance of the plane. It was Karen again, speaking in a sharp voice. James didn't open his eyes at first, but when he heard another voice, one with more authority, he turned his head slightly to see what was happening. A tall man in a crisp pilot's uniform had stepped out of the cockpit and was now standing near the first-class section. His uniform was neat, his captain's hat tucked under one arm. The name tag on his chest read Captain Robert Lewis. His expression was calm but serious as he spoke to Karen. "Is there a problem here?" the captain asked, his deep voice carrying over the murmurs of passengers. Karen straightened her posture and nodded. "Yes, Captain. I was just making sure all first-class passengers are supposed to be here." The captain glanced around the cabin, his eyes briefly landing on James before looking back at Karen. "And is there an issue with someone's ticket?" Karen hesitated, then nodded toward James. "I had some concerns about his booking earlier," she said carefully. "I just wanted to make sure everything was correct." James felt the weight of the moment. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was again, being questioned as if he didn't belong. But he remained calm, watching the interaction without saying a word. The captain turned to James with a polite but curious expression. "Sir, may I know your name?" James sat up straight and met the captain's gaze. He had dealt with countless commanding officers in his time. He knew how to hold himself with quiet authority. "Admiral James Carter," he said simply, his voice steady. The moment he spoke, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The captain's eyes widened slightly in recognition. He straightened his posture, and without hesitation, he extended his hand. "Sir, it's an honor to have you aboard," the captain said with genuine respect. Karen's face went pale. She blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard. The confident attitude she had earlier seemed to disappear in an instant. James shook the captain's hand firmly, but didn't look at Karen. He didn't need to say anything. Her stunned silence said enough. The other passengers who had been watching the interaction whispered among themselves. Some seemed surprised, others nodded in quiet approval. The captain turned back to Karen. "I assume there's no further issue here?" he asked. Karen quickly shook her head. "And no, sir," she stammered. "Good," the captain said, then turned back to James. "Enjoy your flight, Admiral." James gave a small nod. "Thank you, Captain." The pilot walked back toward the cockpit, and Karen, looking flustered, quickly stepped away from the first-class section. James leaned back in his seat, finally allowing himself a small smile. The flight hadn't even taken off yet, but already things had taken an interesting turn. And something told him the lesson wasn't over just yet. The cabin was quiet again, but the energy in the air had shifted. James could feel the glances from other passengers. Some looked impressed, others curious. He knew what they were thinking. A moment ago, he was just another man in a seat. Now, they knew he was an admiral, a high-ranking officer in the Navy. James wasn't the type to seek attention, but he also wasn't someone who let things slide. Karen had treated him unfairly from the start, assuming things about him without reason. And now, after the captain had shown him respect, she had no choice but to realize her mistake. As James adjusted in his seat, a flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Admiral Carter, would you like anything to drink before takeoff?" she asked. "Just some water, please," he said with a nod. She quickly brought him a bottle, treating him with the kind of professionalism he expected from airline staff. It was a sharp contrast to the way Karen had acted earlier. A few minutes later, Karen returned to the first-class section, walking stiffly. She looked nervous as she approached James' seat. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Sir, I just wanted to apologize," she said, her voice quieter than before. James looked up at her, his face calm but unreadable. He didn't say anything right away, waiting to see what she would say next. Karen swallowed hard and continued, I didn't mean to question your ticket. I was just trying to do my job." James raised an eyebrow. "Were you?" he asked simply. She fidgeted with the edge of her uniform. I may have made a mistake," she admitted, though her voice lacked true sincerity. James took a slow breath. He had dealt with people like Karen before, people who judged too quickly, people who made assumptions without knowing the full story. He had learned long ago that patience and dignity were the best responses. "I've served this country for over 30 years, James said, his voice steady. "I've led thousands of men and women. I sat in rooms with generals and world leaders. And yet, when I handed you my ticket, you assumed I didn't belong in first class." Karen opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but James continued. "You didn't question the woman earlier who tried to sit here with an economy ticket," he said. "You only questioned me." Karen's face turned red. She had no excuse, no way to explain herself. James didn't want to embarrass her further, but he wanted her to understand. "The next time you see someone, don't assume you know who they are," he said firmly. "Treat them with respect first. You never know who you're talking to." Karen nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, she turned and walked away. James took another deep breath and leaned back in his seat. The flight was about to take off, and finally he could enjoy his journey. But deep down, he knew this moment had been bigger than just a ticket or a seat. It was a lesson, one he hoped Karen would never forget. As the plane taxied down the runway, James took a deep breath and looked out the window. The airport lights blurred as the aircraft picked up speed, and within moments, the plane lifted off the ground. The familiar feeling of takeoff settled over him, but his mind was still replaying what had happened earlier. He wasn't angry. He had faced tougher battles in life. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Karen had judged him before knowing anything about him. He hoped she had learned something from their interaction. Respect should be given to everyone, not just those who looked a certain way or fit a certain image. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for meal service. The atmosphere in first class was peaceful now. The passengers around him had stopped whispering, and everyone had settled into their own routines, reading, watching movies, or simply relaxing. A man sitting across the aisle leaned over slightly and spoke in a low voice. "Excuse me, sir, but are you really an admiral?" James turned to him and gave a small nod. "Yes, I am." The man's eyes widened slightly, and he smiled. "That's incredible. My father served in the Navy for 20 years. He always talked about how much he respected his commanding officers. I bet you have some amazing stories." James chuckled. 30 years in the Navy gives you plenty of stories," he said. "Some good, some bad, but all of them unforgettable." The man nodded. "Well, I just wanted to say thank you for your service. People like you make a difference." James appreciated the kind words. He had never served for recognition, but it was always humbling when someone expressed their gratitude. "Thank you," he said sincerely. Just then, the flight attendant returned with meal trays. She placed one in front of James, offering a polite smile. "Admiral Carter, here's your meal. Let us know if you need anything else." James thanked her and glanced at the food. A well-prepared dish of grilled chicken, vegetables, and rice. Much better than the meals he had eaten during deployments. As he picked up his fork, he noticed movement at the front of the cabin. Karen was standing near the entrance of first class, speaking quietly with another flight attendant. She glanced in James' direction a couple of times before finally taking a deep breath and walking toward him. She stopped beside his seat, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Sir, I just wanted to apologize again," she said, her voice more genuine this time. James set his fork down and looked up at her. "Apology accepted," he said simply. Karen hesitated, then added, "I really did misjudge you. It wasn't fair of me." James nodded. "I appreciate you saying that. Just remember, respect should come before assumptions." She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I'll remember that." With that, she turned and walked away. James watched her go, hoping that she truly meant her words. Some lessons in life came hard, but they were necessary. Finally, he turned back to his meal, ready to enjoy the rest of his flight in peace. The plane cruised smoothly at high altitude, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. James finally allowed himself to relax. The earlier tension had faded, and now he could enjoy the peaceful journey. He finished his meal, sipped some water, and leaned back into his seat, feeling comfortable at last. Around him, other first-class passengers were also settled in. Some were watching movies on their screens, others had dimmed their lights to sleep, and a few were quietly reading books or working on laptops. The flight attendants moved around, making sure everyone was comfortable. James reached for the small reading light above his seat and pulled out a book from his carry-on bag. It was a biography of a famous military leader, someone he had always admired. He opened the book and started reading, letting himself get lost in the words. About 20 minutes later, he noticed movement near the front of the first-class cabin. A flight attendant was speaking to the pilot, who had stepped out of the cockpit for a brief moment. Their conversation was quiet, but James could see the seriousness on their faces. Something was happening. A few seconds later, the captain turned and walked directly toward James. He stopped beside his seat, offering a respectful nod. "Admiral Carter," the captain said, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb other passengers. "I hope you're enjoying your flight." James nodded. "I am, Captain. Is everything all right?" The captain hesitated for a moment, then leaned in slightly. "Actually, I was wondering if I could ask for your advice on something." James set his book down and gave the captain his full attention. "Of course. What's the situation?" The captain glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. Then he said, "We have a minor issue with a passenger in the economy section. He's a young soldier, recently returned from duty. He seems anxious, like something is bothering him. One of our flight attendants noticed that he hasn't touched his meal and keeps looking around nervously. We just want to make sure he's okay." James immediately understood. He had seen this before. Some soldiers, after returning from service, found it hard to adjust to normal life again. Traveling in a crowded plane, surrounded by strangers, could make them uneasy. "Would you like me to speak with him?" James asked. The captain looked relieved. "If you don't mind, sir. I think he might feel more comfortable talking to someone who understands what he's been through." James nodded and unbuckled his seatbelt. "Lead the way." As he stood up, he noticed Karen watching from the side. Her eyes followed him as he walked toward the back of the plane with the captain. This time, however, there was no doubt or hesitation in her gaze, only curiosity and perhaps respect. James didn't pay much attention to her. His focus was on the young soldier. If someone needed help, he was ready to step in. That was the duty of a leader, no matter where he was. James followed the captain down the narrow aisle toward the economy section. The soft murmurs of passengers, the occasional clinking of cups, and the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin. As they walked, James quickly scanned the rows of seats, looking for the young soldier the captain had mentioned. Finally, they stopped near a window seat where a young man in his mid-20s sat stiffly, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. He had short cropped hair, a strong jawline, and a distant look in his eyes. His uniform jacket was folded neatly on his lap, but his tense body language told James everything he needed to know. He was struggling. The flight attendant standing nearby gave James a grateful nod before stepping aside. The captain gently tapped the soldier's shoulder, making him look up. "Son," the captain said kindly, "this is Admiral James Carter. He wanted to check in on you." The young soldier's eyes widened in shock. He immediately sat up straighter and tried to gather himself. "Yes, sir. I didn't realize." James gave him a reassuring nod. "At ease, son. No need for formalities here." The soldier swallowed hard and nodded, but James could still see the unease in his face. He had seen this expression before, on young soldiers who had just returned from deployments, still adjusting to the idea that they were back in the civilian world. James slowly took the empty seat beside him. "What's your name?" he asked. "Private Daniel Morgan, sir," the young man answered. James gave him a firm nod. "Good to meet you, Private Morgan." He glanced at the untouched meal tray in front of him. "You planning to eat that, or just using it for decoration?" he asked with a small smile. Morgan let out a short chuckle, but the tension in his shoulders remained. "Just not feeling hungry, sir." James leaned back slightly, keeping his tone casual. "You just got back from deployment?" Morgan hesitated before nodding. "Yes, sir. First one." James could tell he was holding something back. He didn't push. He knew that sometimes soldiers needed time before they were ready to talk. Instead, he simply said, "I remember my first deployment. The first flight home felt strange." Morgan looked at him, his eyes searching. "Yeah, that's exactly it. Feels like I'm here, but not really here." James nodded knowingly. "It takes time to adjust. You go from being on high alert every second to sitting on a plane with people watching movies and drinking coffee. It doesn't feel real." Morgan swallowed, his fingers tightening around his jacket. "Yes, sir. That's exactly how it feels." James placed a firm hand on the young soldier's shoulder. "You're not alone, son. A lot of us have been through it. And trust me, it gets better. One day, you'll wake up and realize you're finally home." Morgan took a deep breath, as if the words had lifted some of the weight off his chest. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice a little steadier now. James patted his shoulder before standing up. "Eat your meal, Private. Your body needs it." Morgan nodded. "Yes, sir." This time, when he picked up his fork, his hands weren't shaking. James turned back toward the first-class cabin. As he walked past Karen, she met his gaze. This time, she didn't look away. Instead, she gave him a respectful nod. James returned the nod before settling back into his seat. He had come on this flight expecting nothing more than a quiet journey. But instead, he had reminded someone of an important lesson and helped another find his footing. With a satisfied breath, he closed his eyes. This, he thought, was what true leadership looked like, making a difference, no matter where you were.